Did you know that with New Malice you can deal more than 900 true damage in one single ability? Well, if you don't, let's talk about that a little more. Today we are looking at New Malice. Malice has seen quite a few changes recently, with Hi-Rez kind of trying to figure out its place, how to make it work for ability-based guards primarily, and let's just say it's still not 100% working out. But we're getting there, and we have some new interesting interactions with this item that we didn't have before. So what is New Malice? Malice is still 3000 gold, nothing has changed there. It has 40 physical power, not the highest power item in the game, and for that price it's not that much power, but that's not its primary focus anyways. It has 25% critical strike chance, meaning roughly every fourth hit will be a crit. Not guaranteed every fourth hit, but roughly. And it has a new passive, and the passive is really the game changer here. On a successful critical strike, your abilities deal 35% more damage for the next 3 seconds. These changes were made to make Malice fit in better in its role of a crit item, a single crit item in most situations, for ability-based guards that would then use their abilities. Well, question first of all is if that really works out for most guards. Especially for hunters, this is a little bit wonky, I would say. Because sure, if you land that one basic crit and then use your abilities afterwards, you will get the full amplification, which would be really dangerous. Thing for many ability-based hunters is that they will often use their abilities before their basic attacks to lock a target down or to engage. This, for example, applies for somebody like Uller, who has this combo that he uses first, applies to some degree for somebody like Hu Yi, who will use his stun first. It applies for somebody like Medusa, who will probably use her ult and her 2 very early in the fight, or even Anhur, who will probably use his Impale and then would only get the ultimate amplified. For many of these guards, by the time they land a crit, they might only have one ability left that they can use, and then a 35% damage amplification is typically not as much as, say, just having extra power in the build and extra pen in the build instead, which is also cheaper. Obviously, you still get the crit chance, so the item will give you a decent DPS spike either way, but you also have to keep in mind that it costs 3000 gold, making it a very late game oriented last slot kind of item, and in that situation you will often need other items. Many hunters often go into a single defense item now. You have items that have a certain team utility like Odysseus' bow, you have items that give you a little bit of survivability like Bloodforge, and all of that doesn't really come with Malice. Malice is just more damage. But at the same time, there are other guards who can make better use of Malice. Now the first and most obvious choice here is Naja. Naja has pretty much guaranteed crits in his ultimate, making it very easy to get further damage amplification through Malice. The real question in Naja's case is it enough? Deathbringer also has 40 physical power and 25% critical strike chance, and its passive is critical strike damage is increased by 30%. At first glance, this makes it sound like you would be able to get more damage out of Deathbringer, as you get 30% on 3 strikes, whereas Malice only gets amplification on 2 strikes, as the first strike is the crit that amplified the others. But that's not quite the case, and in order to understand that, we have to look into the numbers a little more. Remember that Naja's ultimate will see a slight change next patch, so these numbers will be slightly shifted in favor of Deathbringer actually, but not to a degree that should make Deathbringer better than Malice in the end. So, in a full build with true damage at that point at level 20, you would deal 186 damage on the pickup when you have Deathbringer, then 428 damage 3 times for the crits, 186 for the hit after the crits, and then 330 for the drop damage. So the drop damage and the pickup damage will be increased next patch, the other hit goes away, doesn't really matter. Total damage is 1986. With Malice, things look a little different. The pickup damage is obviously the same, nothing is different at this point, 186. The second instance of damage is 312, which is less than the damage of Deathbringer, as this ability crits for a normal crit value and not the amplified crit value. But after that you get the amplification from Malice and things ramp up from here. 502 damage for both of the crits, but then the other ability damage effects afterwards are also amplified. So you also get 251 damage for the hit afterwards, and you get 446 damage for the drop damage on landing. And after that, Malice hasn't even run out. You still have like an extra second to use an extra ability if anything is up to deal extra damage. And that's not even the highest value you can achieve with Malice on Naja. Because Malice can also be pre-stacked basically, you can proc it beforehand. either through a basic attack or, what is much more likely, through a crit with your sash. If you use your 2 first and you have your passive up and then use your sash, there's a decent chance to get a crit. And if that happens, then everything in your ultimate will be amplified. That means the pickup damage is already 251 and the first crit will also deal 502 damage. Everything else after that stays the same and Malice constantly gets refreshed through the crits, meaning the total damage ends up being 2454. So you have a solid 450 damage increase over Deathbringer. Shortly, it will probably be more around 400 damage increase, I would assume. If you get a ring toss off after your ult combo, that could be a lot more damage in total though. That is still the most obvious one though. There are some interactions that are actually a lot more scary in my opinion, that are not as straightforward. Something that I tested that didn't turn out quite as well was Daji. Now there's something interesting regarding Daji's ultimate specifically in Malice. Malice technically amplifies your dots even beyond the point of the ability being active. How it typically works in Smite is that when a damage over time ability is used on an enemy, the damage is applied initially or is calculated initially. That means that if you have certain damage amplifications on you and you use a dot, then the dot will deal the amplified damage for the full time, even if the amplification is no longer on you. There are exceptions here. There are things where that doesn't happen. For example, when it comes to protection reduction and the protection reduction goes away, the dot will also deal less damage. But overall, that's the general rule of thumb. Strangely enough, that doesn't seem to work for Daji's ultimate in the context of Malice. When you crit with Malice and you get the amplification and you use a dot, it should normally be amplified. But when Daji uses her ultimate to chain someone and pull them to her, then the dot will not be amplified if it goes past the point of where Malice is active. And that makes the item a lot weaker on her. What you could do otherwise is crit an enemy, go right into your ult, pull them, and they would take a massive amount of damage from Daji's ultimate, which already has high damage numbers to begin with. But for some reason, Daji's dot seems to be calculated over and over. So just because you get an amplified shot damage, it doesn't mean the pull is amplified. And just because the first tick of your pull is amplified, if you happen to pull before the end of your Malice proc, it doesn't mean that the rest of the ticks will be amplified. Daji still makes decent amount of Malice if it happens to crit on her first basic attack, because then not only her horrible burns, but also her passive will be amplified and everything that follows afterwards pretty much, but not as much use as she could otherwise if it actually did something for the ultimate, which already can deal up to 790 plus 240% scaling in damage, and with an amplification would go into crazy numbers. Another ability that works kind of similar to that is Hunbat's ultimate. Hunbat is a god that could easily make use of Malice in the context of his built-in crit chance with basic attacks, but as it stands, his ultimate doesn't work as a dot. It works as a tick in a way where every single instance of damage of the ultimate is its individual instance of an attack or an ability and not a dot. And therefore, after Malice runs out, your damage with the ultimate immediately goes down, meaning you can't do huge AoE damage to a whole team after critting. Besides the point that he usually uses his ultimate to engage anyways. A theoretically more interesting character is NEMESIS. With NEMESIS, you have the ultimate, which does percentage of the enemy's health as damage. That kind of works, but the unfortunate thing is that it works off current health and not maximum health. As such, you have to crit very early in the fight to get a lot of benefit out of this. I kind of highlight this here through an example. If I use the ultimate against a full health target, as you probably relatively often would to make them the prime target of your team, then against a level 20 Rabot, that is 517 damage. If your first basic attack on that same Rabot is a crit and use the ultimate right after, then that ultimate damage is 590. So you have a total damage gain of 73 here, which is, well, not exactly impressive in my opinion. Similarly, her other abilities aren't the most crazy ability damage focused one either, even though they're better now. There could be some funny interactions with your Reflect, but overall NEMESIS should be better off just investing into other things like more penetration to deal more damage with the ultimate or more CDR or something like that. And that brings us to the most interesting amplification, one that I didn't think would work, but actually works. Malice amplifies true damage. And that brings two particular assassins to mind. The first one is BAKASURA. BAKASURA not only deals 70 damage with his Butcher Blades. Interesting enough, they count as ability damage in the same way as everything else, and even though he's not really an ability-based god, he gets the amplification here, and that means that a Butcher Blade, after critting with Malice, deals 95 damage. 95 damage is an extra 25 true damage. Depending on the target, that can be a little or a lot. Against most squishies, you can probably squeeze more damage out of other items over just 25 extra damage. Against high defense tanks, it can be a more impactful number. The important part for BAKASURA, I think, is that this should only be considered once you're very close to the attack speed cap. Before that, you should usually get more damage out of just having more basic attack speed, meaning you get more damage out of the fact that you have more swings of true damage. An extra swing of 70 true damage offsets pretty much 3 extra swings with BAKASURA having Malice. But at the point where you have that maximum attack speed, if you're not looking for defensive choices or other situational choices, that is the time where you can really consider something like Malice on him and get that extra amplification that way. It's definitely a niche case and probably not competitively viable, but if you find yourself against a very hard tank comp, then I think this is an option to get even more damage if you already have items like Executioner in kin size. And that brings us to the last final choice for this item, which is without a doubt the best one. And that is Sir Cat. Now Sir Cat can crit through her 1, which is nice enough already. And if you're lucky, you get a crit on the first hit of the 1, and that way you have amplification for the rest of the 1 already, which will spike your damage pretty hard. As it's 3 very quick hits, it also means you have a decent chance to get at least 1 crit for the proc of Malice. And the moment Malice procs, there's exactly one thing you should do, and that is drop your ultimate on the target. Normally, Sir Cat's ultimate will deal 690 true damage. This damage is amplified with Malice, like everything else, and it goes up to 930 true damage. That means, just by using your ultimate, you will deal almost 1000 true damage to a target, which is relatively hard to avoid, unless they have something like Aegis, but even then, a single tick is still 155 true damage each time. This amplification, in my opinion, is absolutely absurd and is probably also the most viable choice of them all. The craziest thing is that you don't even have to build anything else for it. Sir Cat is this kind of character who can probably build into more defense than any other assassin and still deal good enough damage. But if you can fit in a Malice as a single damaging item later in the build, then you will still get crazy amounts of damage through the potential with the ultimate. A support Sir Cat with Malice last item could still almost half health a squishy just from her ult alone. Outside of that, most interactions with this ability seem to be as expected. The gods I would not recommend building this on is those that use their abilities very, very early and therefore don't really get much benefit out of the effect. I wouldn't recommend it on Mercury either, as he gets most of his damage from basic attacks, not abilities, and would not benefit much from it. And I wouldn't recommend it on gods with executes either, as executes don't get any amplification of any sort, so you're kind of just wasting the effect in that context. So for example, somebody like Kali will probably not make use of it. Somebody like Loki has the issue of front-loading a lot of his ability and damage, but could potentially make use of it depending on playstyle. And somebody like Willish could make very solid use of it, whereas the ones that we talked about before make the best use of it. A few of the warriors could also make okay use of it, though once again, a lot of the damage is often front-loaded. They use their abilities before their basics, and then it makes less sense. And with that, thank you guys for watching. I hope this was interesting and insightful. If you're new to the channel, feel free to hit the sub button and the bell. It really helps me out. Other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out. Random outro sounds. Teach is playing too much Zelda.